Right, I'm Ron Cuttian, the church warden of Holy Trinity in Reading. This church was built by the Reverend Hume in 1826 and opened by the Bishop of Sarum on Christmas Day that year. He built the church at his own expense, and to get his money back, he rented the pews, and if you wanted to be buried down here in the crypt, it was about £40 for a burial. The burials took place for about 30 years, and then Parliament banned the practice of burying people underneath churches, and he then sold the church to the Church of England. And the first priests there were high Anglo-Catholic preachers. They did a great deal of work in this area, which was quite poor at the time. When this church was built, there was nothing on the north side of the lane outside, which was called Peg's Lane. This was just a quarry surrounded by farmland. The housing on the south side of the road was only just spreading out from the town along the main road. And eventually houses were built around here and the parish grew. We were a mother church of St Mary's in the Butts, and eventually when the parish grew big enough, we were granted our own parish status, which was Holy Trinity. And we had, during the revival, the Reformation, we had several priests here, and there were half a dozen deacons. We had a Sunday school, and there were numerous groups for men and women scattered around the local area in houses. The Sunday school grew so big that at one time they had a collection and collected £50, and they were going to buy a railway carriage and put down the back of the church to accommodate the school children. The local government wouldn't agree to that, so it didn't happen. They did an awful lot of work for the poor around here. They were seen on the streets, so everybody knew who the priests were. They would go around knocking on the doors, so they knew all the people, they knew their history, they helped them if they were very poor. And the church was very successful. As time went on, by the 1960s, the congregation had shrunk to only 6 people here, and then a priest called Brian Brindley was appointed. Father Brindley was a big man with a big character, a big mop of curly hair, and he arrived in this church in leathers on a motorbike. He immediately set about building the church up. He took out most of what was left of the Georgian church, including the metal railings which run across the chancel, and he bought lots of things from other churches. The pews in the church are solid oak from All Saints Church in Oxford, which closed down. The pulpit is Queen Anne pulpit, where one of the Wesleys was said to have preached from it in Oxford. He heard about the Pugin screen, which was in St Chad's Cathedral in London, and he went up and had a look at it and made an offer. I think he bought it for about £150 because they were throwing it out. Had it transferred down here and fitted into the church, which is why we're now a Grade 2 listed church. Since he left us, we've had a succession of priests here, none of whom have stayed for more than 5 years, and the last priest left us 16 years ago. He walked out and joined the ordinariate and became a Roman Catholic, and since then we've had no parish priest of our own. However, with the help of retired priests, we've been able to keep the church going. We now have 3 services a week. We're still looking for a parish priest of our own. That more or less brings us up to date with a quick history of the church. Two tombs down here are the Marsack family. There is a street in Reading called Marsack. This particular one served in the forces, but he got into trouble through gambling and lost the money, and I think he was discharged dishonourably. But it looks quite new. This is another one that looks as though it was done yesterday. We don't know why the stone's crumbling away on some of them, and some look absolutely new. These are the original Stations of the Cross. The ones upstairs now were given to us by a funeral director. Some of these are family vaults, a really big one. Unfortunately, all the writing up there is crumbled away and you can't really read it. And nobody made a copy of these. Although we have a list of the people buried here, but we don't have a copy of what the writing was on the church. This one is particularly interesting. We think the parents were missionaries because they were out in Pune in Bombay. Somehow they've ended up down here. And this one is nice because it's got italic writing. It's still quite clear. We're not sure why some of them are black. Maybe they were painted black and then the writing was inscribed, so the writing would have been white, but we're not sure about that. Where this come from, whether it was part of the screen or whether it was brought in some other time. I can't translate the Latin, but it's a beautiful piece of decorative woodwork. Like the church, when the war started, the church was set up as an air raid shelter. This is one of the posters with the regulations, which have been here since 1939. We're not sure whether it was actually used because Reading wasn't bombed particularly badly, or hardly at all really, but it was all there and all the regulations set up. Most people who lived around here had Anderson shelters in the garden, including me, because I lived just 100 yards down the road when I was a boy. But that's stayed there despite being underground, so it proves there's no damp under here. All these arches are numbered, and originally, if the government had continued to allow people to be buried here, they would have been filled with coffins and then gradually sealed off. This little boy died when he was 8 years old, was buried down here. His parents would have gone in the space above him, but when Parliament banned the practice, they weren't allowed to be buried here, so he sat down here, or laying down here, on his own, which is quite sad. The family vault of the Shelder family. We don't know anything much about them at all. I understand from the red walls that something was done down here, also this part here. There was some sort of ceremonies held down here, but it's difficult to understand what, because I'm 5'8" and I can just get underneath there. It's been difficult for a priest to do anything in there, so we don't quite know why it's painted red, but obviously there was a reason for it. We're now on the eastern side of the church, right underneath the body of the church above. One of the interesting things about these plaques is not everybody died young. Here's a lady, Mary Green, who was 90 years old, and above there's another lady who died at 38 years. Most of the people that came to this church when it was built would have been well off, because the streets around the outer edge of the town were built wide. They were big houses, so they'd all had servants. And as there was no transport here, the people would have arrived for the church services by horse and carriage. They'd have all been quite wealthy. And they may have been quite notable families around the town as well. These are the original gates that led through the chancel up to the high altar. They're either Georgian or Victorian, but some lovely, lovely work there. This is a list of all the people who are buried under here. It's quite interesting because in some cases, some of the streets no longer exist. Sydney Terrace, this one here, is now part of Baker Street, so it doesn't exist anymore. Some of the street names have changed. It's also interesting because it gives us a list of the priests who were here at the time when they were buried. The photographer, Fox Talbot, lived just up the road from here, about 200 yards away. He had his studios there, and he took a photograph of Holy Trinity, which probably means it's the first church in the country that was ever photographed, which is quite nice to think of. So the tunnel underneath it's not clear what it was for. It goes down 10 foot, and then there's a tunnel going to the west and one to the east, which goes in about 6 foot before it's blocked off. Prior to the 1960s, the ground outside may have been 10 or 15 foot lower down. It's now been covered over with concrete. So it makes it confusing when you're trying to work out what these things were used for originally. The pulpit is Queen Anne period. One of the Wesley brothers, I think John Wesley, is said to have preached from there when it was in its original situation in All Saints Church in Oxford. The Pugin screen here was originally in St Chad's Cathedral in Birmingham. They decided to take it out in the 1960s because the whole church there is a Pugin church, and it's magnificent in colours, in the chancel particularly, and the screen hid a lot of it and made it unobservable. So Father Brindley went up and had a look at it, and I think he bought it for about £150, had it taken apart, brought down here and reinstalled in here, so we're now grade 2 listed. It does need re-gilding to bring out the best parts of it. The panels on the left and right side are not the original. We understand there were medieval paintings in there, which St Chad's kept. Father Brindley had those gilded things put in. That's the tree of Jesse on this one. The cross on the top is not the original one from St Chad's. It's the original one from Holy Trinity, which used to hang on one of the beams in the roof. This altar set came from Dewey Abbey. It looks as though it's made of marble, but it's actually made of wood, and the painting is particularly interesting because you've got gold and silver very cleverly mixed in together. The window up here is to Lucy Jackson, who was a church warden and 60 years of worship here. We're almost certain that she is a member of the Jackson family that owned the famous store in town on Jackson's Corner. This window is to her husband, George Jackson, and his daughter, where was she? Euphemia. He was the mayor of Reading and also church warden here for 35 years. This painting has been cleaned, repaired and restored. When I knew it in the 1970s, you couldn't see any of the details on there at all. But now it's been cleaned, you can see the rays behind Christ's head. It's unusual in having ropes around his middle. Down here you've got the Garden of Gethsemane. There's a screen down there, and the sun's rays coming up above the clouds. We're not sure who painted it, but one of our curates thinks that it may be the school of Van Dyck. So not painted by Van Dyck, but one of his pupils. The Roll of Honour of people, parishioners who died in the First World War. It's been a pleasure meeting you and taking you around and showing you our crypt and our church. We'd be very pleased for anyone who wants to visit to come and see us. You'll find us a friendly little church. We're not a big congregation, but very friendly and welcoming. Always a pleasure to see people here and coming back to church.